The Dwarves, written by Marcus Heitz and narrated by Fairyprincesslolly.
Chapter 1, Part 2. Border Territory, Secondling Kingdom, Girdlegard, Winter, 6233rd Solar Cycle. Tens of hundreds of tiny grains of sand pelted their helms, shields, mail, and every inch of unprotected flesh. Battered by the gusts, the brave band of dwarves struggled onward, mounted on ponies. Scarves muffled their faces, but the cloth was no match for the fine desert sand, which worked its way through the fabric, clogging their beards and grinding between their teeth. "Bedeviled wind!" cursed Girdlegard Silverbeard of the clan of the Silverbeards, king of the Fourthlings' 12th clans. He tugged at his scarf, pulling it over his nose. At 298 cycles of age, Girdlegard was a respected leader and accomplished warrior. He stood a little over 5 feet tall, and his arms were strong and powerful. His heavy tunic of finely forged mail was worn with pride, despite the trying circumstances. Beneath his diamond-studded helmet, his hair and beard were brown and wiry. He led the party unflinchingly through the sand and scree. "It's the sand that gets me. I've never seen a sandstorm below the surface," complained Bislipper Surestroke, the friend and mentor riding at his side. He was taller and brawnier than the monarch, and his hands and arms were laden with almost as many golden rings and bangles. He looked every inch the warrior, his chainmail bearing the scars of countless battles. The freshest marks were just 5 orbits old, the result of a skirmish with orcs. "Raucus knew what he was doing when he sculpted us from rock. Dwarves and deserts don't mix." The verdict was shared by the rest of the troop. The ponies that had borne them on their long journey to the Secondling Kingdom snorted and whinnied fractiously, trying to clear their nostrils, but blocking them further with all-pervasive sand. "There's no other way of getting there," Girdlegard said apologetically. "You'll be pleased to know the worst is behind us." The band of 30 dwarves was in Sangpur, a desolate human realm under Queen Yumalante's rule. The landscape consisted of nothing but barren dunes and god-forsaken wasteland, a vista so cheerless that the dwarves preferred to stare at the tangled manes of their ponies or the tips of their boots. Their journey south from the Brown Range had taken them through the lush valleys and steep gorges of the mountainous state of Urgon, where Lothair reigned. From there they had ridden over the gentle plains of King Tilligorn's Idaslain, where the slightest hillock qualified as a mountain, and shady forests gave way to fertile fields. The passage through Sangpur was the last and most grueling leg of the journey, a swath of desert 40 miles wide, lying at the foot of the mountains like a moat of fine sand. It was almost as though nature wanted to prevent the rest of Girdlegard, including the Fourthlings, from reaching the range. On occasions, the wind dropped and the veil of sand fell, allowing the mighty peaks to loom before them majestically among the dunes. The dwarves felt the call of the snow-capped mountains, and longed for cool air, fresh water, and the company of their kin. Bislipper tightened the scarf around his cheeks and stroked his graying beard. "I'm no friend of magic, but if we ever needed a sorcerer, it's now," he growled. "Why?" "He could command the wretched wind to stop." A final gust swirled toward them, then the gales died unexpectedly. Only 5 miles separated the dwarves from the comb of rock that ran from east to west. "You're not a bad sorcerer yourself," said Girdlegard, breathing a sigh of relief. He had never been especially fond of the world outside his kingdom, and this latest foray had persuaded him that the one epic journey in a lifetime was more than enough. "What did I tell you? We're almost there." Rising out of the gloom of the mountain's shadows were the imposing walls of Ogre's Death. The stronghold grew out of the rock, the main keep hewn into the foothills, the battlements extending down the hillside in 4 separate terraces that were all but impregnable. Cut into the walls of the uppermost terrace was the stronghold's entrance, 8 paces wide and 10 paces high. Like an enormous mouth, thought Gandagar. It looks as though the mountain is yawning. As the company neared the stronghold, the doors opened welcomingly. 17 banners fluttered loftily from the turrets, bearing the insignia of the Secondling clans. Here at last, Gandagar said thankfully. To think we've ridden right across Girdlegard. The other dwarves joined in his grateful laughter. They were his retinue, a heavily armed band who had escorted him throughout the long journey to the Secondling kingdom. Between them, they were the cream of Goimdil's folk, skilled in axework and craftsmanship, the best warriors and artisans from each of the 12 Fourthling clans. Many a legend told of the fighting prowess of the dwarves, which explained why the party had not been troubled by a single brigand or thief. They were carrying enough gold to make an ambush more than worth the risk. Bislipper waved his hand imperiously, and his summons was instantly obeyed. A little fellow, measuring just 3 feet height, slid from his pony awkwardly and came running through the sand. He wore a wide belt around his baggy breeches and looked oddly sinewy in appearance, despite the considerable paunch that rounded his Hessian shirt. The yellowed undergarment was paired with a red jacket, and his blue cap was pulled low over his face, a pointed ear protruding on either side. A silver choker encircled his neck, and his buckled shoes kicked up clouds of sand as he scampered through the dunes. He bowed at Bislipper's feet. "Sverd at your service, but not of his own accord," he said peevishly. "Silence!" thundered Bislipper, raising his powerful fist. The gnome ducked away. "Ride on and announce our arrival. Wait for us at the gates, and don't touch anything that doesn't belong to you." "Since I don't have a choice in the matter, I shall do as you say." The gnome bowed again and hurried to his pony. Soon he was galloping away from the dwarves in the direction of the stronghold. Even from a distance it was obvious that Sverd was no horseman. He bounced up and down in the saddle, clinging to his cap with claw-like fingers and relying on the pony to set their course. "He'll unman himself if he goes any faster." "When are you going to finally set him free?" asked Gandagar. "Not until he's served his penance," Bislipper answered tersely. "Let's not delay." He pressed his heels into the pony's broad flanks, and the animal set off at an obedient trot. The Fourthlings knew Ogre's death from etchings and stories, but now they were seeing it for the first time themselves. Hundreds of cycles had passed since the last dwarf of Goimdil journeyed through Girdlegard to visit his kinsfolk in the south. In ancient times, the dwarven folks had come together every few cycles to celebrate festivals in honor of Vrakas and thank the smith for creating their race. But the fall of the stone gateway, the invasion of the orcs, ogres, and Alfar, and the annihilation of the Fiftlings had put a stop to that. "Thank Vrakas we're here," sighed Gandagar, standing up in his stirrups to give his saddle-sore bottom a brief respite. None of the company had any instinct for riding. As true dwarves, they would never consent to making a journey on horses. The beasts were untrustworthy, and the saddles could be reached only by means of a stepladder, which was far too undignified. It was bad enough riding on ponies. Their distrust of the animals ran so deep that 2 of the party refused to ride altogether and were traveling in small, easily maneuverable chariots at the back of the procession. "We'll all be glad when this journey is over," said Bislipper, spitting sand from his mouth. The woes of their travels were partly forgotten as Ogre's Death's magnificent masonry loomed into view. Gandagar's eyes traveled over the exquisitely ornamented turrets and walls. Even the outermost rampart was a work of art, graced with plinths, statues, pillars, and other embellishments. "Our folk boast the finest gem cutters and diamond polishers, but Beroin's masons are second to none." The gates to the first of the 4 terraces swung open, and Gandagar's company was admitted into the courtyard. Sverd had dismounted and was standing by his pony. Bisliper signaled for him to fall in at the rear of the group. Dwarves seldom showed their age, but the figure who came toward them had seen 300 cycles or more. "Greetings, King Gandagar Silverbeard of Goimdil's folk. My name is Belengilin One-Arm, of the clan of the Firm Fingers, and on behalf of our ruler, Gundrabur Whitecrown, High King of all Dwarves, I welcome you and your company to the Secondling kingdom of Baroin's folk." Clad in a tunic of chainmail, the stocky dwarf was carrying a battle-axe at his waist. His weapons belt was secured by a finely worked stone clasp. Marble trinkets had been braided into his graying beard, and a long plate dangled behind him. "Come, brothers, follow me." He started on the path that rose toward the stronghold. As he turned, the fourthlings noticed that he was missing one arm. Gandagar conjectured that the limb had been lost to one of Tian's minions. In all other respects, the Secondling was powerfully built, perhaps because of the strength required from working stone. His right hand was heavily calloused, almost bear-like in size, the fingers exuding a power that lived up to the name of his clan. The company followed Belengilin through several gateways until they reached the 4th and final terrace, where he signaled for them to stop. At last they could appreciate the full genius of the stronghold's design. Their host gestured to the doors that led into the mountain. "Dismount and leave your ponies here. We'll take good care of them, I assure you. The delegates are expecting you in the great hall." He led the procession into a tunnel of such vast proportions that a dragon could have entered with ease. What truly took the visitors' breath away, though, was the masonry. 9-sided stone columns, each measuring 10 paces in circumference, rose like fossilized trees. The ceiling was so high as to be invisible, the columns soaring into space. "Perhaps the crown of the mountain is supported by pillars," thought Gandagar, gazing at his surroundings in awe. Stone arches, richly decorated with carvings, spanned the columns inscribed with verses and citations from the creation story of the dwarves. Ahead of them towered an enormous stone statue of Baroin, father of the Secondlings. The ancient monarch sat on a throne of white marble, his right hand raised in a greeting, and his left hand clasped about his axe. His foot alone was as long as 5 ponies, and loomed to the height of a fully grown dwarf, but that was just the start of it. The walls, once coarse, naked rock, had been polished to a sheen, and the glinting surfaces engraved with runes and patterns. The stonework was so delicate, so precise, that Gandagar slowed to examine it. There were underground galleries and chambers aplenty in his own kingdom, but nothing compared to the Secondling's skill. He reached out and ran his hand reverently over the dark gray marble. It was hard to believe such splendor was possible. "By Vrockus," he exclaimed admiringly, "I have never seen such artistry. The Secondlings boast the best masons of any dwarven folk." Gundrabur's counselor gave a little bow. "Thank you. They will value your praise." The company walked between the statue's feet and through another door. There the passageway narrowed and the air felt suddenly cool. They had reached the entrance to the hall. Belengilin turned to Gandagar and smiled. "Are you ready to stake your claim before the assembly?" "Of course he is," snapped Bisliper, before the king could speak. Belengilin frowned, but said nothing, stepping forward to throw open the doors and announce the arrival of the long-awaited guests. The great hall surpassed everything that had gone before it. Cylindrical columns towered to vertiginous heights, and great battle scenes graced the walls, the sculpted marble surfaces commemorating past victories and heroic deeds. Lanterns and braziers of burning coal bathed the chamber in a warm, reddish glow, but the air was cool, much to the delight of the travelers who had endured the heat of Sangpor's desert. While Belengulin was introducing the new arrivals, Gandagar fixed his advisor with a stare. "You would have beaten Sverre for such insolence." Bislipur clenched his jaw. "I'll apologize to the counselor later." They turned toward the assembly. 5 chairs, one for each of the dwarven folks, were arranged in a semicircle around the table. Elegantly carved pews were lined up in 5 blocks behind them so that the chieftains and elders could follow the proceedings and have their say. One of the chairs, together with its corresponding benches, would remain forever empty, a painful reminder of the fiftling's fate. There was no sign of the firstling monarch or chieftains, but the 17 clans of the secondlings had taken their seats. The table was covered in maps and charts of Girdlegard. Before the fourthlings' arrival, the delegates had been discussing the happenings in the north, but now their attention was turned to Gandagar. The king felt a rush of excitement. For the first time in over 400 cycles, the most influential and powerful dwarves of all the folks would be assembled in one room. Never before had he been in the presence of his fellow monarchs and distant kin, and at last the names that he had heard so often attached themselves to beings of flesh and blood. It was a momentous occasion. The other dwarves rose to greet the company with hearty handshakes. Gandagar noticed how the palms differed. Some were calloused or scarred, others tough and muscular, while a few seemed almost delicate. He was touched by the warmth of the welcome, despite the distrust and suspicion evident in some eyes. Then it was time for him to greet Gundrabur Whitecrown, king of the Secondlings and ruler of every dwarf, clan, and folk. He stepped forward and struggled to hide his shock. After 500 cycles of life, the once stately High King was so weak that the mildest breeze was liable to extinguish his inner fires. His eyes, dull and yellowed, flicked back and forth, unable to settle. It seemed to Gandagar that the monarch stared straight through him. Because of his great age, the High King did without cumbersome mail, his feeble body wrapped in embroidered robes of brown fabric. His silvery hair and beard swept to the floor, and in his lap was the crown that symbolized his office, too heavy for him to bear. The ceremonial hammer lay beside his throne, its head etched with runes and its handle inlaid with gems and precious metals that sparkled in the light of the braziers and lanterns. It seemed doubtful that the monarch could summon the strength to lift the heavy relic. Gandagar cleared his throat and swallowed his trepidation. "You summoned me as your successor, your majesty, and now I stand before you," he said, addressing the High King with the time-honored formula. Gundrabur inclined his head as if to speak, but no sound came out. "The High King thanks you for following his summons. He knows that the journey was arduous and long," Belengulin explained on the monarch's behalf. "If the assembly wills it thus, you shall soon wear the crown. I am Gundrabur's deputy, and I will speak for the secondlings." He gestured for Gandagar to take his place at the table. Gandagar sat down, and Bislipur took up position behind him. The fourthling monarch leaned over to inspect the maps, only to realize that some of the delegates were staring at him expectantly. They seemed to be waiting for him to stake his claim more roundly, but Bislipur had warned him against showing his hand too soon. His priority was the situation in the north of Girdlegard, and he was eager to see how his proposal would be received. "Where are the 9 clans of Borengar's folk?" he asked, nodding toward the empty seats belonging to the firstlings. "Not here?" Belengulin shook his head. "No, and we don't know if they're coming. We've heard nothing from the firstlings for 200 cycles." He reached for his axe and lowered the blade over the far west of Girdlegard. The dwarves of Borengar's folk were the keepers of the Silver Pass, the defenders of the Red Range against the invading troops. The human realm of Queen Wei IV separated their kingdom from the rest of Girdlegard. We know they're still there, though. According to the merchants of Weyern, the Silver Pass has not been breached. It's their business if they choose to stay away. We must vote without them." The other members of the assembly murmured their assent. "King Gandagar, you wish to ascend the throne. But first, you must hear of the challenges that await you. The perished land is creeping through Girdlegard. Every pace of land conquered by Tien's minions is affected with a terrible force that turns nature against itself. Its power is such that even the trees become intent on attacking and killing anything that lives. People say that those who perish on this ground return to life without a soul or a will. The dead become enslaved to the dark power and join the orcs in slaying their kin." "The perished land is advancing?" Gandagar took a deep breath. It was clear from the counselor's words that the Magi had failed to stem the tide of evil. "I never trusted Longin's magic," he said heatedly. "All those fancy fireworks, and to what end? Nuden, La Ionin, Andakai, and the rest of them are all too busy perfecting their magic with too clever by half apprentices. They scribble away in their laboratories and castles studying the secret of elven immortality so that they can scribble and study and scribble some more. And all the while the parish land is creeping forward like rust on metal that no one has remembered to treat." His blunt words were met with noisy approval. "At least some good has come of it. The elves have been all but annihilated." Gandagar's heart leapt at the thought that the arrogant elves would soon meet their doom. It was his firm intention that he and his warriors would inflict the final blow. The elves had murdered his father and brother, but now the time of reckoning was near. Soon the feuding and fighting will be over once and for all. He was itching to tell the others of his plan. "All but annihilated?" echoed Belingilin, frowning. "Elders and chieftains, this is joyful news indeed." Gandagar's cheeks were flushed, and his brown eyes shone with enthusiasm. "Raucus has given us the means to wipe out the children of Citalia. The last of their race are gathered here." His index finger stabbed at the small dot on the map representing all that remained of the elven kingdom. "Listen to what I propose. Let us form a great army and march on Alinger, and extract our vengeance for deeds that have gone unpunished for cycles." The delegates stared at him, dumbfounded. Bisliper's surprise tactics had worked. "Gandagar, we gathered here today to elect a new High King," Belingilin said evenly, trying to deflate the excitement. It was clear from the murmured conversations that the Fourthling King's proposal had struck a chord. "It is not for us to talk of war with the elves. Our duty is to protect the peoples of Girdlegard." He turned imploringly to the benches. "Friends, remember the commandment given to us by Vraucus." Gandagar scanned the faces of the delegates. He could see that they were torn. "First listen to what I have to say. Documents have come into my possession, ancient documents, uncovered by Bisliper and handed to me. Hear what they speak of, then decide for yourselves what should be done." He took a deep breath, unfurled a roll of parchment, and read in a solemn voice. "And the elves were filled with envy. Desirous of the dwarven treasure, they fell upon the Fifthling kingdom and ambushed Giselbert's folk. Fierce fighting broke out in the underground halls and the stone gateway. Some of the enemy were trapped by Giselbert in a gloomy labyrinth, never to be seen again. But the treacherous elves used their magic to poison the children of the smith. One by one the Fifthlings succumbed. The elves seized their chance and slaughtered the ailing dwarves. Only a handful of Giselbert's folk escaped the massacre." Silence descended on the great hall. Gandagar's words echoed in the minds of his listeners, his commanding voice breathing new life into the ancient script. Drawn by the smell of death and bloodshed, orcs and trolls marched on the stone gateway and gathered at the border. The cowardly elves fled in terror, abandoning Girdlegard to its fate. But before they fled, they used their cunning to open the portal. Girdlegard and his remaining warriors defended the pass with the staunchness of true dwarves, but their depleted army could do nothing against the hordes. It was then that evil entered Girdlegard. He paused to measure the force of his speech. With a little more persuasion, he would have them on his side. Only Gundrabar's one-armed counselor was shaking his head. "I do not trust these lines, King Girdlegard. Why were they not discovered before now? It seems strange that a document incriminating the elves should emerge at this time. It suits your purpose rather well." "The document was hidden, who knows for what purpose? Perhaps by a doubting dwarf like yourself who lacked the conviction to go to war," came Girdlegard's scornful reply. He raised his axe and buried the blade in the map, cleaving Allender. "You heard what the document says. They killed our kin and betrayed us. They must pay for their murderous deeds." "And then what?" said Bellingen harshly. "Tell me, King Girdlegard, who would benefit from the destruction of the elves? Their deaths won't further our interests, nor those of mankind. No, destroying Allender will profit the perished land alone. We may as well join forces with the Alfar and help them to victory. Is that what you want?" The counselor fixed his eyes on Girdlegard, who suddenly felt dangerously exposed. "Our real enemies aren't the elves, your majesty. Vrockus didn't give us the authority to fight the peoples of Girdlegard. By my beard, none of us can stand the elves. It's in our nature not to like them. There have been skirmishes, even deaths, I know." He placed his hand on his left shoulder. "I lost a limb in a fight with 4 orcs, but I'd sooner sever my one good arm than raise it in war against the elves. Our races have their differences, but Vrockus bade us to protect the elves, and we have never neglected our task. Do you propose to break his commandment?" Girdlegard fixed the one-armed counselor with a furious glare. Bellingen had sabotaged his plans for vengeance, and nothing he could say would mend the damage. Through the silence, he heard Bislipur grinding his teeth. "The Alfar are no friends of mine," he said at last. "No, this is about seizing our opportunity. Once the elves are defeated, I will lead our armies to victory against the Perish Land. Tien's minions have plagued Girdlegard for too long. The dwarves shall triumph where humans have failed." "You surprise me, King Girdlegard," said Bellingen, an expression of open bewilderment spreading over his age and experience-lined face. "Surely you don't mean to defy the commands of our God? It seems to me your reason has been subdued by hatred." He paused and eyed Bislipur suspiciously. "Unless false counsel is to blame." The delegates shuffled and muttered until a secondling from the clan of the Bare Hands rose to his feet. "It is my opinion. The matter is worthy of debate," he said firmly. "What if the document speaks the truth? Once a traitor, always a traitor. The elves might leave their crumbling kingdom and found a new settlement by seizing human land. What if they betray another of our folks?" The speaker, a chieftain of the same clan, leaped up, burning with zeal. "The pointy ears will stoop to any level. I can't say whether or not they murdered the fithlings, but they should be punished all the same." He left his place and stood alongside Girdlegard in a public show of support. "You may be a fourthling, but I stand by your cause." Shouts of approval sounded from the benches. The dwarves' low voices rumbled through the chamber until all that could be heard was a single word: war. Bellingen's calls for order were drowned out by the noise. Girdlegard sat back and exchanged satisfied looks with his advisor. Girdlegard will soon be free of elves. At that moment, an almighty bang rocked the hall. "Silence!" a voice thundered sternly through the din. The delegates turned in astonishment. Crown on his snowy head, Gundrabar stood perfectly erect before them, the ceremonial hammer in one hand. He had swung it against the throne so furiously that the marble revealed deep cracks. His eyes showed no sign of age, only recrimination, as he looked down at the chieftains and elders. No dwarf was more majestic, more imposing than he. His former weakness and frailty had vanished, driven out by rage. His white beard rippled as he raised his head. "Short-sighted fools! You should be worrying about Girdlegard, not settling old scores. Any race that pits itself against the parish land is our ally. The longer the elves can repel the powers of darkness, the better." His gaze fell on Girdlegard. "You are young and impetuous, king of the Fourthlings. 2 of your kin were slain by elves, and for that I am prepared to excuse your misguided call to arms. The rest of you should know better. Instead of indulging him in this lunacy, you should be voices of reason." Gundrabur scanned the assembly. "The time has come to bury our grievances. An alliance is what we need, what I desire. The elves of Alinger, the 7 human sovereigns, the 6 magi, the dwarven folks must stand united to repel the parish land. I—" Just then the hammer fell from his grasp and crashed to the floor, chipping the flagstones. The High King swayed and sank backward into his throne, his breath coming in short gasps. Belengulin instructed the delegates to retire to their chambers and await his summons. "We shall resume our meeting when the High King has recovered." The representatives from the various clans filed out silently, Gundrabur's words still echoing in their minds. Bislipper cast a scornful look at the wheezing figure on the throne. "He won't last much longer," he muttered to Girdlegard as they made their way out. "When his voice dries up entirely, we'll have the chieftains on our side. They were ready to join us before the High King interrupted." Gundrabur's chosen successor made no reply.
Hello friends, this is Gone for Hammerhands. Thank you for checking out Fairyprincesslolly's channel. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe button. And if you'd like to support these magical creations, fly over to our Patreon and join the fairy family. Safe travels!